Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikisis's Digital Classics. This is our third session of this autumn term for Sunoikisis's Digital Classics. And today, given that this term is focused on, let's say, digital philology within our Digital Classics program, we have a session about text analysis with the Voyant Tools. As usual, you have the class outline in GitHub with a detailed description about the outline, seminar readings, further readings, resources with many links, and also an exercise. And today, our guests are Aurélien Berrat from Paris. He's professor of, let's say, classics. He teaches, classics and digital humanities. And then we have Christopher Ohge. I apologize for my mispronunciations as usual. And Christopher is a lecturer in London, lecturer in digital approaches to literature. And then we have Gabriel Bodard. I don't need to introduce Gabriel. Gabriel probably will join us in a few minutes. And but I think we can start. And we have an interesting outline today, so with various things, but I think we can start with Christopher. So Christopher, thank you for joining the program. This is the first time that you participate in this program, so really thank you for joining us. And I think, so Christopher, you can start, and I think I can also share your screen. Okay, here we are.
Great, thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Can you see my speaker notes?
Yes.
Okay. It's always interesting to know whether those are showing as well. Right, so thanks so much for inviting me. What I want to do as quickly as I can is to survey the main ideas that underlie text analysis. So the principles, the tools, the new modes of reading that we get from performing text analyses. And the way I want to start is to ask the basic question. So what is it really? And what it comes down to ultimately is, there we go. It's that we're using computational tools and programming languages to analyze text data of varying sizes. And primarily we're doing this by yielding quantitative results. This can include simple character and word frequencies, mean word usage, linguistic calculations such as type token ratios and hapax percentages. And what these do is allow you to identify things like repetition, brevity, unique word clusters, and so on. That's really the basic answer to what text analysis is, but it also can be broken down into making arguments about historical trends in big corpuses. So relating to form, style, sentiment, or content. And the forms that this can take is through basic statistical analyses, so counting relative word frequencies, calculating word pairings, which are called collocates, looking at n-grams, which is groups of words, usually in 2 or 3, but sometimes more, that co-occur. Average word and sentence length, mean word usage, organizing words that occur too frequently to be studied one by one. Basic statistics, really, that can be analyzed and clustered. So also corpus analysis is an important aspect of this. And this is basically pattern recognition across multiple texts to find detectable patterns. And then linguistic analyses, which can boil down to parts of speech tagging, lexical variety and uniqueness, topic modeling, sentiment analysis, stylometry. And the results of this can either take the form of things like various kinds of visualizations, such as maps, graphs, and trees, network analyses, and other kinds of pictures. Now, the principles that underlie text analysis, the work of it, the first thing that has to be mentioned is relative frequency. This is based on a reasoning method by John Stuart Mill called the principle of concomitant variation. And if you'll just bear with me for a second, this might not stick the first time I read this, but take a moment to think about it, which is the magnitude of an antecedent variable changes in proportion to the magnitude of a second variable. Now, what that means in plain English is that effects are typically proportional to their causes. And what that means with texts is that those that have relative frequency ratios that are similar tend to be correlated and may be causally connected. And the more that you have correlation, the more that there is correlation, the more likely it is that they are causally connected. And one example that this could take is a text being authored by the same person. But it's also important to stress that when we're talking about these variation changes, we're often looking at the ways in which these concomitant variations have to do with genre. So, for example, the relative frequencies of the top words in a drama, for example, will be words like I and you, whereas in a prose treatise, for example, the top words might be the and. Now, those would have negative correlation because the top frequencies, relative frequencies, are not the same. They're distant. Whereas if you have a bunch of play texts, if you're looking at the ratios between the top high frequency words, there's more likely clustering of similar kinds of genres. So concomitant variation is an important way of a starting point for how texts will cluster statistically. Now, another way of doing this is to think in terms of exploratory data analysis. And this is attributed to John Tukey, the mathematician. And this is a task in which you are clustering similar groups of results, statistical results, based on simple statistical calculations and geographical representations of those statistics. And I've just listed here, for example, some types of statistical methods: Burroughs delta, cluster analysis, principal component analysis. You can look at those on your own time. It would take a lot more time to explain each of those, but they all involve using various calculations of relative frequency and plotting similarities and dissimilarities in either in visual space or in kind of tabular format. Now, from there, you can start to use your inductive powers and probabilistic thinking to generate some general hypotheses from the results that you get from these first two principles. But you have to understand that while you are doing this work, the results are only probabilistic. They're only as good as the quality and comprehensiveness of the data set, and the data provenance is also just as important. And what's important to think about here is that in doing exploratory data analysis, you're not only refining your sense of what your beliefs are about the corpus, but you're also adjusting what you think is true about the corpus. So there's a kind of iterative process involved in taking these statistical facts and making them to tally with your hypotheses and assumptions. So in other words, when you're doing text analysis, the numbers that you often get are not reflective of the truth. It's reflected of, it hopefully reflects a justified true belief, which is itself subject to lots of change as you engage in the next principle, which is computational close reading. And that's looking closer into specific instances of your text, looking for disaffinity and exceptions between the statistical data and what you know about the text, and also letting your research questions guide the exploration, and of course, exercising some skepticism about what you're seeing in the results. Finally, the last principle that I'll draw your attention to is distant reading, which can be distinguished from computational close reading because you're making much broader claims about historical text data by analyzing huge samples of data. And I'll say more on that in a minute. But I want to return to asking another question, which is, what is the point of studying relative frequencies of the most common words? And here I've just given a picture of the most frequent words in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is visualized in Voyant Tools, which we'll hear more about in a moment. But as you can see, this kind of strikes you as strange that you plug in this giant novel with all kinds of philosophical and spiritual import, and all you see is the and of and that and his. Well, what does all that mean? Why is that worth thinking about? Well, one of the ways that you can think about this is to understand that there is a lot of value in studying common words. And this is something that computational linguists have been thinking about for a while. Anthony Kenny, for example, thought that the dull common words are much more significant and was somewhat perplexed by the mysterious veneration that literary scholars have for these unique words in texts, when in fact the signature of people's or text style often comes from these most common words in texts and their proportion to other texts with these same common words. So one of the pioneers in this was John F. Burroughs. He wrote a book called Computation into Criticism, 1987, which used computational method to study roughly the most 30 common words in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where you get Burroughs' delta from. He said in a later article that the styles of author or their signature imprints come from their most common words, so articles and prepositions, auxiliary verbs, and things like that. He said the real value of studying the common words rests on the fact that they constitute the underlying fabric of a text, a very visible web that gives shape to whatever is being said. The principal point of interest is neither a single stitch, single thread, nor even a single color, but the overall effect. Such effects are best seen, moreover, when different pieces are put side by side. So that's, in effect, concomitant variation applied to text. Furthermore, he said that computer-assisted textual analysis can be of value in many different sorts of literary inquiry, helping to resolve some questions, to carry others forward, and to open entirely new ones. So that shows you exploratory data analysis as well as using a kind of inductive method that I alluded to in the previous slide. Now, let's just shift for a moment to distant reading and interpretation, because what we just learned about was generating relative frequencies and using our powers of close reading to examine things like the most common words. But another interesting form of text analysis is to really broaden the scope into what's called distant reading. So this is attributed to Franco Moretti, who had written about distant reading in an article from the early 2000s, which was then elaborated in his Graphs, Maps, Trees book from 2007, in which he said, quantitative research provides a type which is ideally independent of interpretations. It provides data, not interpretation. So the interpretation comes after you've generated some data, but of course the data itself changes the nature of the interpretive enterprise. And he reformulates this notion of literary history by shifting the gaze away from extraordinary people and events to everyday facts or everyday discourse, and how those structures of discourse aren't really about those extraordinary people, but rather about trends in society that can be better documented and analyzed using computers. And what literature itself can be found in this large mass of cultural data that goes far beyond the canon? It's an interesting question. He said abstraction is not an end in itself, but a way to widen the domain of the literary historian and enrich its internal problematic. What's important about this point is that he's offering a new model of knowledge based on distance. And this is a model that raises the level of abstraction to increase cognitive capacity. Now, why is that important? It's that the more that you raise the level of abstraction, the less input you need to understand very broad ideas without having to import all of the memory, as it were, into your own brain. You're shifting the memory onto the computer to create new layers of abstraction to increase your own cognitive capacity to interpret a huge amount of information that you would not have been able to interpret in any time before that. So what directions of travel can you take by engaging in text analysis? Well, as I suggested, you can test a hypothesis or a thesis about an author, text, passage, genre, period. You can test the claims of a critical idea. You can investigate how and the extent to which authors differentiate the voices of characters or narrators in a work. You could investigate shifts in style, how they change over time. Investigate the history of an important word or concept or group of words or concepts over a long time period. You could study the effects of genre conventions over a long time period. Investigate the claims of authorship. Many other things, but the important point was evoked by David Hoover in an article of 2013. It's no less true today. The computer's greatest strengths are in storing, counting, comparing, sorting, and performing statistical analysis. And that makes computer-assisted textual analysis especially appropriate and effective for investigating textual differences and similarities. There are two different ways to engage in text analysis. One is computer assisted, the other is computational. I only point this out because it's good to know what you're getting yourself into when you do text analysis. The computer assisted mode is an easier mode by using out of the box tools to generate results. And of course, the pros are that it's fast and you have inbuilt interfaces, visualizations. Cons are that you lack control over features and sometimes you can't manipulate data and it's sometimes hard to validate and replicate results. The computational approach is to use a programming language to generate results. And by doing this, you would have much more control over not only manipulating data, but reorganizing it and doing whatever the coding language can do for the text that you're interested in. And of course, the con is that it's hard and you have to learn a programming language, or at least learn how to modify one, which is worth the time if this is something that you really feel like you need to do. But computer-assisted approaches are very useful and can do quite a lot of work. So you need not be intimidated by getting into this line of work. And you don't need to be a computer scientist to do it. You can use computer-assisted approaches to do very good work. These are the options for performing text analyses. Today we're focusing on Voyant, but I figured I would also give a list of other tools. And for corpus linguistics, there's language databases, text database tools, and of course the programming languages, mainly R and Python. There are others, but those are the two main ones. So for distant reading, I just wanted to give you a quick example of what quick example of distant reading. So I pulled up a Daily Mail article because I was amused that this made the mainstream press. But this is from Matthew Jocker's work of distant reading, analyzing genre conventions, saying that after analyzing 40,000 novels, he found that there were only 6 possible archetypes for storylines. This is from James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Here's the man in the hole versus the man on the hill, general storyline archetype in 40,000 novels. And here's a Dean Koontz novel that is compared to his archetype of a thriller type novel. So this is just a quick example of distant reading. I also wanted to show you a quick example of computational close reading, which is from a project I did where we were doing text analysis of marginalia in Shakespeare. And this is just generating simple word counts of how many words were marked in Herman Melville's copy of Shakespeare. And as you can see, this kind of information would be impossible to make sense of without computation. Being able to see how many marked passages there were in, Titus Andronicus versus Othello, and then starting to ask questions about why he may have marked certain passages over others. But this is a good case of text analysis being able to look very deeply into a fairly small data set of someone's reading of Shakespeare. And likewise, with this Melville example of reading Shakespeare, you also have the employment of lexical uniqueness values to understand the length of markings per marking in his reading of various plays by Shakespeare. And this is just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that you can do, studying genre in a very broad sense by using 40,000 novels, or looking at something extremely granular, namely, how did one particular author read Shakespeare and how can we create statistical valence from that data? From there, we can talk more about Voyant Tools, because again, as I said, Voyant Tools is one of the best computer-assisted web-based tools for doing text analysis. So I am going to hand off to my colleague, Ariane.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. Yes, Ariane. So I'm sharing your screen, or here it is. Okay.
Excellent, thank you. So my screen so far is just the wiki on which all the materials are. Thank you, Christopher. As you said, I think that writing your own code, typically in R or Python, is always going to be a more flexible solution for exploring your data, customizing your results, visualizations, etc. But also, well-designed tools can go a long way. And this is why we chose Voyant Tools, because it includes many of the stable types of analysis that you just mentioned. So this is a gateway tool, but also something that on its own has real value for understanding data and thinking about the data you know. Because the most important will always be to look critically at your data through analysis, visualization in an exploratory process. And exploration is exactly what is at the core of Voyant Tools. So the goal is that after this session, you are all confident that you can just throw your text and basically any corpus at Voyant Tools and see what happens. Try and play with it. By the way, we had previous Sunoikisis Digital Classics sessions featuring Voyant Tools, especially as a visualization tool. So feel free to browse the archives as well. And now I will just show how Voyant Tools looks when you open the page. So just the Voyant Tools Ohge, the main Canadian landing page for Voyant Tools. And what you can do on this page, which is the starting point, is select a corpus or input text in that box and press the magic reveal button, which imports the data and quickly makes all subsequent operations in the interface possible by creating lists and statistics. Yes?
Sorry for interrupting. Yes, we can see the screen. Can just zoom in a bit when you share your browser, because in YouTube is a bit
right. But you do see Voyant Tools, right? And you say that it's the format rather.
Yes, because
like that?
Now is better. Yes, and I'm checking on YouTube. Yes. Excellent.
If it's better like that.
Yes, I'm also checking in YouTube. Yes, unfortunately, this is sorry, Aurélien, just for our audience, because they are on YouTube, and also for the audience, this is Voyant Tools, so we have to see many things. So unfortunately, and inevitably, the texts are small. But I think that your audience can follow us in any case.
Sure, but the point is that
you can, please.
Everyone can explore the interface. And then in this part of the presentation, I give you an explanation as a tour of the interface, and then everyone can play. And when it's relevant, we actually extract one tool and make it full page. So should be better.
Yes, exactly. But now is perfect. So thank you, and sorry for interrupting.
No, you're right. So Voyant Tools, as they say in this landing page, is a web-based reading and analysis environment for digital text. It's open source, and it's based on 20 years, actually, of tool building. It has a rich history of research and teaching in Canada, especially by Stéphane Sinclair, who was a professor of literature, who first worked on the French Oulipo experimental literary movement, and very sadly passed away last year, and Jeffrey Walkwell, who is a professor of philosophy. So I just mentioned that the main developer, Stefan, passed away, and we know that everyone actually wants to keep the tools alive. So Voyant Tools is probably not going away, but also, sustainability and maintenance is a huge issue for even a very popular digital humanities suite of tools as Voyant. So part of the beauty of the environment is that it was and still is in constant development with improvements over the years, and also new tools, new possibilities in what they call widgets. That is the different tools you see in the different panes. To have an idea of the broader intellectual project of the authors, you have the reference of a book, Hermeneutica, which was published now 5 years ago by Rockwell and Sinclair. And you have the reference, and they explain that they don't want to do one tool, the one tool that would do everything, but rather do sort of a platform with solid, flexible, friendly, and even playful instruments that you can experiment with on your corpora. And I think the background is improving the digital literacy of humanists. And in this respect, it's probably already a success with all these years and this reputation. So when you arrive, you load a corpus. In this case, I just gave the landing page a URL for us to have an interface and something in it. So these are the definitions of DH, which have been collected by someone on GitHub. And you see that English is detected, so stop words are applied. You filter the most common, the, and, etc. Words that Christopher mentioned. This would not be automatic for any language, so there is a bias for English, and it's easier to work with English, but Voyant Tools is exceptional in its coverage and intention to make multilingual analysis possible. So you can give it a URL if your text is open. You can give it plain text by copying it. You can give it a file, which is often what we do. You can use built-in demo corpora of Jane Austen and Shakespeare. And also, you will see it in our examples in a few minutes, you can load several files at the same time in one zip compressed archive, which makes it possible to have a corpus with several documents, so segments in it that will be analyzed as a whole, but also as related parts, and that will be very precious. So the default view is that you have all the widgets in one global text dashboard, which they call the skin, with default tools, all the widgets that are actually highlighted in blue. It's like tabs on each pane that you can select, or you could also replace in each pane the currently displayed tool with another one from a list. One last thing general thing about Voyant Tools, it works on the web, but there is also a server version if you need to deal with sensitive data or just want to have the power of your own machine. And it's the same Java application which you actually launch locally in your browser. So the basis for Voyant Tool is to do analysis with the tokenized corpus. So you break your corpus on import into different tokens, usually words, by default words, and statistics are then generated, which will be available for all subsequent visualizations and the dynamic exploration I promised. I will give you an idea of the essential widgets, which we'll see in the examples. So from the start, you have at the bottom left, one of the most essential, the summary widget, which gives you a descriptive view, a view with descriptive statistics for the corpus, how many words, how many documents, and several aspects of it. Top left is the word cloud, the famous and infamous word cloud, which is called Cirrus in Voyant. And you can see also, if I go to that widget, that when you hover on the near these tabs on the menu, you can actually do several things, including define options for the tool, which can also be used globally for all the tools. This is where you will have options like filter stop words or choose more widget-related options. So a word cloud with options, and you can modify the parameters. In this case, for word cloud, it's just the number of terms, and you have a cursor here, which on the fly will change the visualization. Obviously, a word cloud is just a way to access the first elements of a frequency table, which is what the terms widget contains. Frequency table with search boxes, so you can input your search and have the result to filter from the list. You can also have the options, define which columns in different widgets are shown, so same thing. And you even have a sort of extra little overview related to each term with this plus button, which opens a pop-up. So that was for the terms, which are really the basis of any view of a text in a quantitative perspective. The trends widget here on the right, top right, is what most people use because it's a very useful visualization along the corpus time, narrative time, or document sequence with default equal segments, which show you how the number of hits for a word is evolving from a few to many, like that, with diagrams, with bars, and you can also choose a type of visualization here and do different things. And if you go crazy and don't remember what you've done, you just reset the graph instead of keeping it as you put it. So you have also in the center the reader, which is obviously the text itself, which has been loaded. But you also see that in the reader at the bottom, you will have a distribution of the term, and you see where you are in the text, in the course of the text or the corpus. You have phrases, which are, of course, the n-grams, so recurring sequences of characters. You have a concordance called context, giving you for each term what is n words of context to the left and to the right from your term, left and right, which document features the term, and you can have more context if you use the cursor. The context is actually a keyword in context, a quick concordance, which is a very common tool. I just mentioned and don't show two more elaborate tools, scatter plots. I will demo an example later, which gives you an introduction to more detailed, more deeper, actually, statistical analysis. The principal component analysis that Christopher mentioned, for example, and the topics tool, which gives you the themes, the topics that actually emerge from an algorithmic perspective. And you have, with the question mark, documentation for everything in Voyant Tools. Basically, I think that these are the essential tools, but in the documentation, or when you try with this little window image icon to change the tool, you have the list of the tools, and you will see that broken down into different categories. You have currently, I think, 24 tools structured in different categories, scales, types, but they do mostly what people do when they do corpus linguistics or computational linguistics, like counts, concordance, co-occurrences of words, but also sometimes they go to more trendy DH tools like topic modeling. I'm not developing that now. Or do actually, in some cases, experimental artistic approaches to your text. You can have a look at textual arc if you want to see what I mean, for example. And to finish the tour, I should add that all widgets can be exported as a separate view in a different window. That's the third on-hover option here. You can export the data itself, an image if needed, or a view in a different URL. You can export textual data or list in HTML, TSV, that is the same as CSV more or less, JSON, or images, or also, that was very interesting and telling about the project, you can export code, an HTML snippet using an iframe to query the Voyant Tools API, technically. You can export a capsule which will be autonomous and can be embedded into any website. So if you want to do something with Voyant Tools, through Voyant Tools on a different website, this is possible. And last but not least, I think that it's very useful to think of Voyant Tools as a set of resources, but not as just one environment that does everything, as I said. And one of the marks of that is that you often will find it useful to open several interfaces, several windows, to compare corpora, to compare versions of corpora. So you feel free to experiment with that. We'll see the strength now and limitations, of course, of Voyant Tools. It is easy. It has connected tools, since what you do in one widget will have impact on what is being shown actually by the other widgets. That's really interesting. It mostly aims at lexical analysis. So you're not using the explicit and coded structure that HTML and especially TEI would allow. You will most of the time ingest these encoded, annotated files as plain text. So it's more computational in this sense. And also, as we'll see, corpus preparation is really paramount, as always. For example, lemmatization, which is so essential for ancient Greek and Latin, is not something that Voyant Tools could do. So Voyant Tools wanted, as I said, to have a friendly interface, embedding usual linguistic tools in linguistics, but also it wanted to cover more tools and more languages rather than trying to go deep with tools that are cutting edge or too difficult to use in such an environment. So it's not about going deep, it's about reflecting on what you do a bit more on the surface and trying to bridge the gap between reading, as we are used to do, and computer assisted reading, as to use Christopher's phrase. So deeper encoding may have to happen elsewhere. It cannot be that readily used, but Voyant Tools gives you another way to think about your text and to work with them. So I hope with this quick introduction that you will be able to navigate. What we'll do now, and Monica, I will hand it over to you, is that we have some illustrations with cases that will make it possible to give more substance to what I just said and see the strengths and limitations, as I said.
Okay, and just to speak of close reading, I think this is the book that Aurélien was mentioning. So sometimes we use books. This book is not open access, but there is a companion website, and the link is in our class outline. But I think now we can go on. So with, I think, Christopher. So if I'm following
with actually with me as well, because Gabriel.
Sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
Oh. No, yes, of course, yeah, because we have a complex outline today. Yeah. So I have to share again your
yes,
stream.
Yes. Just to say that Gabby wanted to talk about alienus, which was interesting, but also we we had distributed the widgets and the types of analysis that were more interesting to illustrate with different corpora. So I know what Gabby was trying to talk about with this corpus, and I can just tell you a bit more about that on another one.
Unfortunately, Gabriel Bodard can't join us for a technical problem because he can't really join StreamYard. But anyway, we have a lot of material, so I think we can go on with you, Aurélien. Okay.
So what I'm showing you as a semi-live demo, because I'm hardy but not foolish. I'm not trying to import everything as we speak, but this is already, and you have the link on the wiki, is first a non-lemmatized Voyant Tools corpus from the edition of CEST that is on the Perseus Digital Library. So it's not lemmatized, and I think it's interesting to show that dealing with non-lemmatized text has its advantages, obviously, but that you can also try to do things like, it's not very legible, of course, for you, but looking not for example, if I just show you this, Catilina, right, which will be 28 hits in the corpus, but Catilina with an asterisk, which will be actually the whole present paradigm of the word, and we then see how the presence of the character evolves in the trends tool. So using these kinds of abbreviations is what the syntax for Voyant Tools, which you access here, makes possible. It's a bit more refined than that, but just looking for trying to do sort of a wild lemmatization is just reducing the string of the characters is interesting in many cases. So about also just showing this first non-lemmatized corpus is also a lesson in lemmatization choices and pre-processing, because if you just use the text as we probably would, just importing the digital text that we have, you will find that publicam, publica, for example, is a bit everywhere, and publicae, so it's very prominent. You get the feeling that it would be one of the most frequent words, but you can't really say if you don't go and do the count yourself in this non-lemmatized version. But also, so you could just go ahead and type public and see what happens with your search box. But also, it's obviously in not only most, but all cases, if you try public asterisk in the context tool, you see that it's obviously in each occurrence, it's just a part of the phrase res publica in different cases, the state. So this is something that you will not be able to grasp just with a lexical analysis. And if you do have some interesting phrases not using res publica but something else, and you're interested in it, then you're out of luck. So pre-processing can be just modifying your source and making sure that res publica is one word, or that two words in such phrases are just having a hyphen or an underscore to be able to look for them. So another example is that when you switch to the lemmatized version, which is here, and also using the right keywords, stop words, lemmatization makes visible the uses of the adjective malus, so bad, which involves a judgment from the author, obviously. You have many forms of the adjective, but they, since there are many, they're not conspicuous in the non-lemmatized version. And I just compared the terms tools, and you see that among the 25, and you can go even below that, 25 most frequent terms, you don't find malus, whereas once you have lemmatization, it comes as in position 13, which is actually quite high. And seeing that you can see different things with non-lemmatized and lemmatized corpora is an illustration of what I told you about using two tabs, two windows at the same time. I mean, you don't have to be constrained by the space of the predefined tool. You're dealing with your corpus and you're using all the tools that you have. So this is also for the items and the widgets that Gabriel was thinking of, the word cloud, lemmatizing outside of Voyant, using stop words in Voyant, and the stop words in this case, and then I'm done with CEST, are added by way of adding an element in the URL, which is semantic. You can actually keep the URL for Voyant Tools as a way to access the corpus. It's persistent, but you can use stop list equals and the name of the stop list instead of using the options, which you would do here using stop words, and either let it detect the language, use no stop word list, or define a list, or final solution, you could use the Latin, but then edit the list. And if you edit it, you have the default list, which I happen to have given to Stefan for Ancient Greek and Latin, but you can add terms, right? So if I want oops to be filtered out, I just use my new corpus, my new stop words list, that's its name, and oops has been removed. And now I also have the link, since I copied the unique ID of the stop words list, and it can be applied to this corpus or any corpus. So if you do want advanced options, there are ways to use it beyond just clicking around. That's it for the Latin example.
Okay, excellent. So I think, okay, removing. So now I think that, okay, I'm following the outline. I think that Christopher can present his example. Okay.
Yes. Can you see?
Yes,
you see
excellent.
Mine?
Yes.
Okay, so I should preface this by saying that I am not a classicist, but I have uploaded translations of the Iliad to just illustrate a few interesting features that that I like to use. One is quite a simple feature, which is a lot of people will upload a single text from from a URL or from a local file into Voyant Tools, and as we just saw, you can learn quite a bit and explore quite a bit just from doing that. But another thing you can do that's really interesting and sometimes extremely revealing is to upload multiple documents. And here, what I did was I uploaded 2 documents, which is Chapman's translation of Homer's Iliad and Pope's translation. And immediately what happened is we got the standard word cloud, which you've already seen. But here we've got this trends graph, which shows trends within each of the files. So you can compare trends between texts. And this can be very useful if you're trying to plot the differences between various texts in one author or among different authors. So immediately here you can see some pretty interesting issues, namely Chapman's highest frequency substantive term is sun, whereas in Pope's translation, it's a lower frequency term, relatively speaking. Whereas in Pope, the word shall has a higher ranking than in Chapman. And Jove kind of seems to be level from each text, which is fair enough and worth not, well, it doesn't show that much variation. You can, of course, plug in other terms based on the word cloud here and examine those kinds of variances further. I would think that particularly if you're looking at translations, you might find some really interesting questions to pose about the frequency of certain terms in each text. Another thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is links. So here, by clicking on links, which is in the top left of the widgets, I'm going to just export this so that you can see this a bit clearer. And what links does is it shows you collocations. I mentioned collocations earlier in my presentation, and this allows you to find which words are connected to other words. So you might start generating some interesting questions immediately by hovering over the word great and seeing that it's often connected to Sun, Achilles, Hector, Jove. This might not be terribly surprising to you, but one of the things that these tools can do is to kind of verify assumptions that you might already have and back them up with linguistic facts, such as this. But you might also look at the differences between the word sun in relation to king or in relation to Jove, and start to ask some questions about why those linkages are showing, or why how the word shall is functioning linguistically in connection to these ideas. So the links tool can often show you some interesting connections based on collocations. And similarly, there's another tool that I wanted to show you, which is the termsberry, which is here in the middle. Normally you'll get the reader, but you can also click on this termsberry. And this tool is somewhat similar to links, except it gives you a bigger picture, I think, of what words tend to co-occur. So this is more like a cluster analysis than a simple collocation search. So here we've got the word great in relation to Hector and Sun and Jove, but you can also kind of see from the termsberry the distance between, say, Hector / great versus Ajax / great. And you can see in this example that indeed, you know, the word great is not only used more often in relation to Achilles, but you know, Ajax is used in connection to great quite a bit, but not as much as Hector and Achilles. Okay, fair enough. But the strategy button here in the lower left corner allows you to look for kind of narrative clusterings. And this is where a lot of people will start to make text analyses based on narrative ideas and themes and topics and so on. But you can also change it to distinct terms. So right now we're in strategy. We're going to change it to distinct terms. And the distinct terms gives you the most unique words, the most distinct terms in each text. And this is just a different view on understanding linkages between these texts, and thinking too about, you know, instead of what's the most common words, what are the most unique kinds of words, and where are those unique words clustering with other words. So I just wanted to show to you why we tend to use these kinds of linkages tools to visualize high frequency terms in relation to how they co-occur, how these words are appearing in proximity to one another. So I have found that particularly when you're looking at narrative style, that these terms can be very useful, whether it's using top terms that are co-occurring, or whether you're looking at distinct terms that are co-occurring. Ultimately, it depends on your research questions, as I said earlier, whether you tend to look or tend to use Termsbury, for example, to look at the common words or the most distinct words. I have found that it depends on the research questions. So that's all I wanted to show with those two tools. Unless there was anything you wanted to add to what I just said.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for mentioning, yes, research question, which is the key word for this, well, not only for this semester, but in general. And I think that we have seen many interesting things for our students. So I don't know now, I don't know if we want to go on. I think we have a
last example.
A last example, exactly, the Odyssey or Yang. And Gabby,
yes.
Welcome.
And switching Gabby in this wonderful recreation of Terry Gilliam's Brazil. I don't know. So
okay, here is.
I will start with a very simple fact that using. So that's my next link. That's the Odyssey by Books. So imported as a zip file with different elements, different files in one environment, as we mentioned. So you can see that in this case, in the Trends tool, since my documents are being used as segments that will be compared, I'm actually looking at what happens in each book of the Odyssey. So this is the non-lemmatized version. And what is striking, if you have a look at the word cloud or the terms tool, is that with this non-lemmatized version, I did use the ancient Greek stopwords, but something went wrong. What did go wrong? The apostrophe. So just a warning, always mind the apostrophe and details like that, because if your stopword list is not including certain types of characters, apostrophes, if you have problem with spaces, underscores, whatever, you may have less conclusive results, less interesting results. So make sure in the pre-processing phase you mind about these things. Of course, I customized the ancient Greek stop list to have something more interesting to show. So that's the same corpus without the problems. So I just added these apostrophes in the common terms. This still non-lemmatized version of the corpus is a great way to demonstrate the phrases tool. It's not a big problem if you don't see the detail, but I'm using it to show the phrase epeapteroenta, the winged words, because obviously the ancient Greek epic is a wonderful stable example of formulaic language, right? So you see that you have several occurrences of variations of the phrase, but you have actually 30 places. And if I click on that line, you will see where they are on the phrase, sorry. Of I said those winged words, and this is a recurring expression. It should have here been displayed straight away in the reader at the bottom, but even anyway, I can do it manually as I just did. So you can see with these spikes where the phrase is used, and you can go from one context, actual linguistic context, to the other in the reader tool. So phrases are very often a way to see not only which phrase occur, but also the distributional profile at the bottom of the reader tool, or then in the trends. If I switch to the lemmatized version, of which you have a link, then I think we should say a word about, and following up on what Christopher said about the summary tool. It may seem modest first because it's, it's the basic information that you're expecting, how many documents there are. So my 24 books, of the Odyssey, but how many words and how many unique words, so not tokens, but types. But you also have an overview of the length of the different parts of the corpus, of the different documents in this case, and of the density of vocabulary, that is, how many times a word, a type, is being used. And also, I would like to point out the two last elements, the average words per sentence, which is in some cases a very telling feature of a text. In this case, for example, I think it's interesting because it is a problem. I see that there is a surprising amount of variation. The figure I have for book 24 and a bit less, but still for book 16 is much higher than what I see for the other ones. And this is reflected in this little spark line. So this is a very nifty tool introduced by Edward Tufte to show you an overview of the distribution, a graphic overview of the trends, and it appears in different places and widgets in Voyant Tools, so that's quite interesting. And you see that there is a spike at the end for the last part of the poem, and especially the last book. So why? We should try to explain that. This is an outlier if we were dealing with the usual visualization graphs that we do with these sort of distributions. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that there are more speeches versus narrative in some books. Perhaps it's an artifact of the way the edition and the digital text I'm using is displaying punctuation, because in the end, to tokenize and recognize sentences and not just words, Voyant Tools must have a method, and this is, as is usually done, by looking at capital letters sometimes, but mostly punctuation. So punctuation, I suspect the middle dot is not treated as a punctuation. The Greek colon, if you like, is not treated as a punctuation separating two sentences. So this should be analyzed further. And the other one is the distinctive words. So this is akin to what Christopher was showing in the Termsbury. But in this case, it's just a list of which you can define the scope. So how many items you want in each list of distinctive words. I went a bit far, so it has to be recomputed. And you see that for each element of my corpus, each document, so in each book, I see which words are used, not the most as an absolute frequency or a relative frequency, as in the trends tool. You can switch from the one to the other, but which are the most distinctive, the salient words. And this tool is just implementing the very classic IDF algorithm. So term frequency, inverse document frequency, to see which words are common to the different documents, hence not very specific, and which words occur only or specifically or predominantly in some documents. And this makes it possible to weigh the terms and say something more interesting. In many cases, and this is what we see here, if I just go back to the very basic list of, I suppose, 5 or 7 terms, we see that often these terms indicate the actors, the themes, the background, the landscapes, which are essential in a book. You see that Telemachus is in book 2 at the beginning when we are in Ithaca. Nestor, talking a lot, is in book 3. Alkinos, one of the contenders, is in book 7 and 8 as the the most frequent word, most salient word each time. And you can see also that Calypso and Ulysses' raft are essential in book. I noted this down. So in book 5, Circe and her filter in book 10. And if we can go to 21, but my browser is apparently refusing to do so, we can see that, well, I should reload this perhaps. Ulysses' bow is actually in book 21 the best example, because it's used almost only in that book, and it's extremely relevant to the action and the symbolism, obviously, when he's actually shooting down everyone in Ithaca. But always look, when you try to have a look at these distinctive words, always look at the absolute frequency and the context, because otherwise you might jump to conclusions with a sort of a pseudo statistical justification. If I try to say anything about book 1 on the basis as brittle as 3 hits, 6 hits, 2 hits for these distinctive words, probably I'm not saying anything meaningful. So as usual, these tools are here to trigger interpretation first and foremost. And last example is a separate view as a scatter plot. So this plot is actually, in my analysis here, a correspondence analysis, but you also have principal components analysis, which were mentioned by Christopher in the introduction. And this is basically about showing the distribution of the documents in blue with little lozenges here, and the salient, most frequent terms which are associated to the documents, coming from the documents, and they are spread in a two-dimensional space, so on your screen. And what you see there, they are shown with a proximity or a distance based on the computation that was made initially. So as in network analysis, the terms and their documents and the documents containing them, of which you have a precise list here on the right-hand side column, are shown. And if I just use 2 dimensions to add a last thing about that, I would like you to see that on the left-hand side, bottom of the screen, we actually have a few outliers, as I said. So book 12 seems to be quite different from the others. And here we have 9 and 10, closer to the center, but 12 is really apart. And if you link the book with the most distinctive words here, you can guess that there's something about ships, vessels, and about comrades, companions, and sun, which probably makes it possible to just understand that book 12 is about the island of the sun, whereas book 5 here, more in the center on the left, but up, you have the sea and a goddess, and this is book 5, and this is the one about Circe. So you have the islands, the geography appearing here. The islands are set apart by their vocabulary, whereas if you go to the right-hand side and more to the bottom, all this cluster that has been highlighted in blue, and I can select how many clusters the computer is trying to make visible, is about Ithaca. So basically you have the islands and the sea, and you have home and the Telemachus here, and the palace and the wife and Ulysses here, appearing as a cluster that will, if you have a look then at the number of the books, correspond mostly to the beginning when we are in Ithaca, and to the second part of the Odyssey when Ulysses is coming back home, and trying to reconquer the throne. And doing so, he's setting a very different type of action, hence different vocabulary. And this is showing very nicely in a two-dimensional space. But be aware, as I said, that such a statistical procedure analysis is based on a selection. Any analysis, any visualization is a simplification of the data. And in this case, this kind of visualization involves spreading along different axes, 2, 3, and it only takes into account, because the rest is not meaningful, it's just noise for this analysis, for the x-axis, so horizontal, 25% of the text, and for the y-axis, vertical, only 12%. So it's not a very sound basis. It's suggestive, it's clearly interesting, but if you want to read something into these procedures, you really have to do it with care. But usually with this type of visualization, when there is something like above 30% of the terms of the corpus used to visualize, then it's already quite an indication. But I just end by saying that this is a view, to use the Voyant Tools jargon, a view of your corpus. Everything you do in a widget is only one interpretative perspective on your corpus, and you're trying to explore the corpus. Of course, you can export images, lists, and show something with it. There is a possible demonstration, explanation, but it's about also trying to model, change, play with it, and see if you understand better your text, refining your assumptions. That's it for the Odyssey.
Yeah, one thing, thank you for showing us this. If you go back 1 second to this visualization, yes. Because, sorry, this parenthesis, okay, I'm the classicist. I love this because when you mentioned the fact that we have the islands and then Ithaca home, we don't have the map here, but in some way we have the geography through the text of the Odyssey, which is something very interesting for us, because now when we read the Odyssey, okay, we have the map, we immediately go to see the map to identify, to locate the place mentioned by Homer, okay? But here, probably, we can get more a sense about how ancient people could, let's say, perceive geography when listening to the Odyssey, because of course then we have the complex questions about the Homeric poems, which were not read really in ancient times, or at least only at a certain point they began to be read. But I think this visualization is very interesting, okay? The geography without the map, but with the text. But now I stop here, and I wanted to mention this because I'm doing something similar, but for the text of Herodotus, and so, but of course, as Aurélien said, you have to be very careful because you have to understand this data and you need to contextualize the data. But now,
can I add just one point about that? In pale blue, what you have is the actual documents, which could be named in a more, concise, terse way, so that it's just more legible. But anyway, you have a narrative geography as well here. That is, if you link the order of the books and see how they are spread across the geography that you just highlighted, then you see something else, and that's interesting as well. You're linking the different steps, the different parts of your corpus in a non-linear fashion, according to different criteria.
Yes, exactly, which is especially fascinating, especially for the Odyssey, considering the how the epic was born. But now, so I don't know if you want to comment on the exercise, or we still have 15 minutes, so we have time for questions. And please, for students or other people on YouTube, please ask your questions, any questions, of course. We have seen many different examples belonging to different literatures, but please don't be shy. Any questions?
I just want to underline something that Ariane just said, which is I found in my own work in this area that you often generate more questions than answers when you're doing this work. The important thing is that you're broadening the horizons. That's where the distant metaphor is really helpful. It's not just distance in the sense that you have much more access to memory and processing in a way that wasn't possible before, but you also have much more access into these views or these windows into different ways of thinking and interpreting, and that always generates more questions than answers. I might not even be an expert in the classics, but when I start plugging into these files, you'll notice a lot of interesting results, some of which are dead ends, some of which lead to things that nobody had thought before. So it's just a good point to emphasize, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is also the fascinating part of this work. So we always generate new questions. And one thing maybe, because here we can see visualizations, new possible questions, but if we want to prepare data, can you say something about that? So the Voyant Tools is, let's say, it's documented, you can use it, it's quite, well, let's say, I can't say easy in the sense that, again, you have to understand the data you are using, and then you have to learn how to use it, but let's say it's a user-friendly tool. But if you want to prepare the data, especially for our students, what recommendations? Here we have seen examples with one text. We have seen different languages in English. Then we have seen ancient Greek, translations of ancient Greek, and then Aurélien and Christopher have mentioned also problems concerning text or, for example, punctuation. So you have to be very careful when you prepare your data. But your recommendations for preparing your text or your corpus, can you say something about that?
Yeah, I can start. I think the best, well, there are two answers to this question, actually. One is that you need to have an awareness of your data provenance. So where's the data coming from? What's the quality of the data? Who prepared it? How accurate is it? Et cetera. Beyond that, I think most people who work in this space would recommend a TXT file using UTF-8 encoding. Because that's the most machine readable and platform independent kind of data. Other than that, I would just recommend other kinds of platform independent open access type of data like XML. I was going to show a demo of an adaptation of Voyant for one of my projects that I'm affiliated with, which uses XML data. But Voyant will take various data formats as long as they're machine readable. But does anybody else have anything to add to that?
I mean, that's the essential. It's dealing with plain text, which is the usual computational way to do it. Because what Voyant does is two things. First, it strips the text from every tag that it finds in the XML, for example, or if it's like a docx or PDF, it's just extracting the text, extracting the plain text that is actually in the text layer of your PDF, or if you don't know it, don't fall from your seat, from the docx, which is just a bunch of very large with many useless files, actually XML files in an archive, which is called docx. But what it's doing, it's going to query the docx database, if you will, and take the plain text from your docx, which most of the time is just a few megabytes or even bytes from a huge file. So it actually removes everything that has been added. But also, second thing it can do, in the actual landing page, the home page you start from, you have some options. So we didn't go into details, but you do have some pre-processing options that you can choose if you want to do something a bit more refined with Voyant Tools. And if you use the server version, you can also do things that could be a bit more elaborate. But then mostly when people pre-process text, what they do is that they use text editors. That's a very simple way to go. But otherwise, you work with, dedicated tools like Oxygen or things like that for XML, or you use programming languages to do bulk modifications and reformatting and conversion.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for mentioning all these possibilities. Of course, if you want to, for example, if you have an XML file and you want just to extract the text, there are various possibilities. Of course, a problem is about, for example, I can mention ancient Greek because you, Aurelian, you had an example with ancient Greek. Be careful about the encoding of ancient Greek. Punctuation, definitely. The middle dot is a problem, is not considered usually as a punctuation, also because other punctuation in ancient Greek are treated like in English, so they are used for sentence splitting, for example. So you have to be very careful about that. The apostrophe is a well-known problem. So check, because what you see is not really what is behind the text, even if the Greek looks correct. Well, we know that there are problems, and given that there are many texts, for example, for ancient Greek, but also for other languages that are the result of OCR, we have to consider these problems concerning character encoding, because then we generate wrong results or the results we are not expecting.
And it's even worse than that, because very quickly you fall back to the essential, the core problem we have. These are modern versions of things that were not like that at all. And what you're actually dealing with is editorial choices for the actual tokenization which was made when we print out and then digitize something with spaces, but also for the punctuation. And depending on the language and the time the edition was made, this can vary significantly.
Yes, absolutely. We can have different versions. We have different versions of the same text with different punctuation, which was not extant originally in the text. That's the intermediate level, the level of editions. Exactly. But we have a question in the chat. Okay, and we have a question about lemmatization. So how can we get access to a lemmatized version of a text?
Do you want me to start?
If you...
Okay, there are several ways. Base case scenario, you are in your field, it can be Latin, Greek, anything else. You are aware of a very specific resource with people who have done very careful work because it was part of the research. And I'm thinking, for example, for Latin and Greek, of the LASLA in Liège, which is from the 70s onwards, one of the prominent laboratory centers for linguistic research on ancient corpora. And they have, I shouldn't say few corpora, but relatively, it's a relatively little database, because everything is checked by hand. They're part of speech tagging, or their editions have been checked multiple times by people who most of the time were actually adding a text to the base because they were working on it, doing a PhD, a postdoc, or something like that. So it's very high level human proofread quality, but you don't have the same coverage. And if your text is not there, you're out of luck. And if it's rather late than classical, you're probably out of luck. And then it's not even open yet, though they are themselves, the team, very open to working with people. So it's not clear-cut that you will have something like that. Then second thing, you have general databases like what Perseus did when, 10 years ago when they started, and then until now, such groups of scholars have been applying to the whole corpora they had the methods that have been devised to do, I mean, proper lemmatization. So you do have GitHub resources with the lemmatized Greek and Latin in what is sometimes a rough version, but it's fully usable. If you show the lemmatized version to a specialist, they will probably have a heart attack. But if you use it to do something that involves statistics, probably you will find things and it will be useful. So correcting a few terms, if you know your corpus, you probably can reach like, I don't know, 90–95% of correct lemmatization, which is not good in computational linguistic terms, but very good for certain usage. So that's the other solution. And then third solution, you have actual new methods being devised now with people doing neuronal networks to renew the way we were dealing with lemmatization, not using dictionary-based methods, but actually artificial intelligence to get something more satisfying. So I think it's going somewhere. For Latin, you have a lot of projects, and for Greek as well.
Yes, Aurélien, thank you for mentioning also the methods for accessing today lemmatized version of it. That depends on the language. For Greek and Latin, we have resources. If you go to PerseusDL in GitHub, you find the corpus. Of course, as Aurélien said, well, there are many problems. But to be honest, to lemmatize a text is always a problem. If we do that manually, I'm sure that the classicists in the room will disagree on many things. So there are it's a complex thing. But still, we begin to have data. I don't know for English. If Christopher, you want to say something or okay?
I'm not aware of a lot of work being done in that myself, but yeah, that. It's not my area of expertise either, so there may be that I don't know about.
No problem. And for classical languages, you can also access the Classical Language Toolkit, where you can find links to resources and methods for lemmatization of of historical languages, not only for Greek and Latin, also for other languages. And I think that in the class outline, you mentioned Diorisis, I think, which is another, yes, Aurélien, so which is another corpus for ancient Greek, where you have also the lemmatization. And there are, for example, problems for still, because we miss data. It's not only a question to get correct data, but we miss data. I know that for personal names, for example, for geographical names, where we still miss lemmata, also because the data we have are based on traditional dictionaries, where generally you don't have enough proper names, but you have common names. So this is another part of the problem.
Gabby is mentioning something in the chat. Gabby says that he will show his students in a seminar next week how he created the alien corpus he was planning to show, a limited version of it from Diorisis. So that's what he had been using. Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to point out that the more computational and more recent methods are starting to be language independent, which is really fascinating, because the problem we have as scholars is that if we say we can do lemmatization at the language level, I can lemmatize Greek, I can lemmatize English, we're just fooling ourselves. Lemmatizing Homer, lemmatizing Plato, and lemmatizing a Byzantine text is not the same animal. So it always depends on the scope and what you're trying to do.
As with many things. I wonder, we had in our outline a demo that I wanted to show. Do we have a little bit of time that I could just show this very quickly?
Yes, please. If we have a few minutes, yes.
Well, I just wanted to mention that, you know, we were showing you the web-based version of Voyant Tools, but as we heard, you can also download a desktop version yourself, but you can also access Voyant Tools' code base, and it's open access, it's open source, which means that you can modify it. And I just wanted to show you that it's possible to modify a Voyant Tools adaptation for a particular project. So what I'm showing you here is a project that I'm affiliated with called Melville's Marginalia Online, which is both a project documenting Melville's reading as well as a virtual library of his surviving books with his marginalia contained in them. And the director of this project, Stephen Olson Smith, spent a good deal of time over the last year or so working with performance software to develop a Voyant Tools adaptation for the Marginalia project. And to keep with the theme of classics, I'll show you Melville's copy of Chapman's Homer, which you can see a virtual sort of bookshelf view of here. And if you click on the actual book, you'll see eventually, although it's taking a while, the view that you get, which was sort of the classic view of the marginalia, which gave you page images of marked pages and annotations in a fairly basic viewing panel, such as you're seeing here. But the Voyant adaptation was seen to be a necessary enhancement because marginalia itself is a very fragmentary kind of text analysis. You're attending to responses to text through annotations, but also marked text through markings. And how to make sense of all of that is very difficult to do by just browsing through this viewer that I've just shown you. So the Voyant adaptation is seen here, that when you click on a particular text in the project, you have these visualization options here with visualize these marginalia. And what I'm showing here is the terms table, which you're now familiar with. And you get a nice simple list of the top words that were marked and annotated. And right off the bat, you start asking yourself some interesting questions, like in Homer's Iliad, you're seeing a lot of words appearing in relation to life and sort of living. And the word death is the 10th most marked word, but overshadowing the word death is all of these words relating to earth and strength and life and so on. So some interesting results that I was surprised by. But you can also switch to a word cloud. And as you can see, the Voyant widget is loading on this project's own server and using the project's specific XML data to generate the same kinds of visualizations that you see on voyanttools.org. So I just wanted to show this because it's important to emphasize that with open source tools like this, you can actually repurpose a tool such as Voyant for your own particular interests. And I should say this this took a bit of work and some money, but it wasn't a super expensive job. And with the existing code base available to you, you can develop tools such as this for your own projects.
Thank you very much for showing this, because this is another important aspect, exactly. So about using extant tools, about sustainability. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel every time, especially because in projects in the humanities, maybe we don't have enough knowledge to produce these tools, but also because we don't have enough resources. And in general, as a method, this is not only about knowledge and resources, but as a method. So try to use extant tools for your work. So really thank you for this last example. But unfortunately now our time is over. So we have to finish. So really thank you. It was really very, very interesting. And in any case, you have the class outline in GitHub, also an exercise, but Voyant Tools is documented, so you have enough documentation, you can try to use it. And if you want, you can also add questions and comments in the GitHub issues, okay? So next week, we will have another session about text encoding. This is the second session about text encoding of this semester. The first one was last week about inscriptions. Next week we have a session, text encoding, but about objects, so the physical encoding, the encoding, sorry, of physical object like inscriptions and papyri. But for today, really, thank you very much to our guests for your time and for this really wonderful discussion, considering different texts, really. And so, okay, so see you next week, and good night, good morning. We have a big audience all around the world. And so really, thank you, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.